So, good afternoon, everybody. We will continue on the chapter about mortality. And just an overview here, we did talk so far on this chapter more about methods, right? The methods of estimating mortality indicators that we can compare mortality levels of different populations that have diverse age composition, age structure. So with the standardization and life tables, we can generate such mortality indicators and we can compare the mortality levels and trends of societies that have different age structure. And now we will go through an overview of mortality changes in the world and also in the US. And then I hope that next class we'll be able to cover these last three topics on infant mortality, future course of mortality as it is explained in the textbook, and some overview of the current pandemic using data that I got from different sources since the beginning of the pandemic until now. And just to remind you, here looking at our syllabus, so we are here today, November 9th, Tuesday. So we are pretty much 3 classes delayed and we'll be 4th, and I expected that. But the idea is to finish the mortality chapter this week until Thursday. And then on Tuesday next week, we will have exam 3 that will cover the topics that we discussed after exam 2. That's a portion of the fertility chapter and also mortality. And then after exam 3, we will go into chapters 8 and chapter 9 related to internal and international migration. And that's actually how it worked in previous semesters as well. Always I put there chapters 11 related to race ethnicity, chapter 5 about family and sexuality, and chapter 6 about contraception. But if we want to go a little bit more in depth on these topics, I take more time. So we should expect to see chapters 8 and 9 between exam 3 and before the final exam. And remembering that the final exam is exactly at the date stipulated by the university. So it's on a Wednesday instead of a Tuesday or Thursday. Okay. So now we will then go into this short history of mortality in the world. Just going back here to the slides, and the slides for internal migration, international migration, and all all these other topics here in the syllabus: race, ethnicity, family, sexuality, contraception, birth control, population distribution, population policy, and the Earth in the 21st and 22nd centuries. All the lectures, the PDF files are available in the course website, right? So they were all uploaded there. If you try to click on the link and it doesn't open for you, just refresh your browser page and you should be able to do it. If you have any problems, just send me an email, okay? So in this portion of the chapter portions of this lecture here come from that other textbook by John Weeks, Introduction to Population. I mix information from him and also from our main textbook in this course. This is the overall structure of this subtopic in this lecture here. We will define what is health and mortality transition, talk about health and mortality changes over time. We already talked about what's the difference lifespan and longevity. We are concerned with longevity, the average number of years that a population would live if they were exposed to the age-specific mortality rates measured for a specific population, a specific year. Also discuss about disease and death For the life cycle, causes of death, they vary between younger adults and older people. Causes of poor health and death, and then health and mortality inequalities, right? So whenever we are talking about mortality, we are actually talking about morbidity. It's not just this topic within demography, it's not just focusing on how fast or how long people live, how fast people die, or how long people live. We also want to understand the health of this population, and health is measured by the prevalence of disease in the population. And prevalence of disease in the population is exactly morbidity. And the pattern of death that we already discussed a lot when we saw the age-specific mortality rates is the pattern of death. The pattern of death, we can do it by age groups, as we saw before. We can do it by race, ethnicity. We can do it by sex, and so on. And the same thing can be done by morbidity. Usually we look a lot at the prevalence of disease in the population broken down by age groups, exactly because different age groups have different higher or lower chances of dying of specific or being exposed to specific diseases and dying of those diseases. Overall, as we discussed since the topic of the demographic transition theory, the demographic transition theory, as we saw in previous lectures, is pretty much that empirical finding, historical finding that mortality declines as we have industrialization and development. And after a while, fertility also declines. And then we reach into our society that have really low levels of mortality and fertility. And this first moment in which mortality declines before fertility, you have a huge population growth because you still have a lot of people being born. And in this moment of this mortality transition, Omran proposed this term of epidemiologic transition. And we discussed that in the chapter about theories of mortality. So pretty much what we see throughout history, different societies passed through this epidemiological transition in different time points and in different speeds as well. But pretty much you have a change from a prevailing poor health, a lot of people having a really high prevalence of diseases in the population, high morbidity, and high death rates. So high mortality means people on average don't live that long. And this high morbidity and high mortality are primarily caused from communicable diseases. So people being exposed to infectious diseases and usually affecting the morbidity and mortality of young people. So in this pre-industrialization, pre-modernization of our societies, the young people and the children are really exposed to these communicable diseases, a high prevalence of these diseases that cause them dying young. So really high levels of mortality. And then we change into a society with better good health, or like better good health, with better health standards and low death rates, right? And now we have lower death rates due to infectious diseases, with most people dying at older ages from degenerative diseases. Then you start to see people dying because of Alzheimer's, because of all these different diseases that we didn't see that much before. Does it mean that we don't die because of infectious diseases anymore? No. We have lower rates, lower chances of dying because of that, but then you see specific moments in history like the one that we're experiencing right now with the coronavirus pandemic, that the proportion of people dying due to infectious diseases increased in these last years, okay? And of course, with higher chances of people dying due to the coronavirus, if they are older people, right? So you have the exposure to the whole population, the young people get infected, usually nothing serious happens to them, but then they transmit it to older people, and the older people are much more likely to die, right? From virtually all of human history, early death was commonplace. So whenever we talk about this average age of dying of around 70, 75 years that we see nowadays, that's really related to more recent decades. But in only beginning about 200 years ago, we have been steadily pushing death to older ages. So exactly because of like really simple health measures, sanitation, public infrastructure, like having treated water, sewer system implemented in cities, all that contributes to a better health of the population and a better health, especially of children. And infant mortality rate declines and child mortality rate declines. Infant mortality rate is the mortality of those that die before reaching age 1, and child mortality rate of those dying before reaching age 5 or age 15. The survival of more people to even older ages is a key contribution to the demographic transition. So people don't die due to these communicable diseases, live longer, and you start to see an increase in life expectancy at birth. Most people now survive to advanced ages and die pretty quickly. So what happens now is that we all reach more advanced ages. We reach overall around the ages of 70 or late 60s and 80s. And then we reach those ages, most of the population dies around those age groups. So the variability by age in mortality is compressed. And epidemiologists and demographers call this process of when mortality variability by age is compressed, they call it this rectangularization process of mortality. Why? There is this increase, why we use this term, an increased rectangularization of mortality. This can be expressed in this graph, for example, right? Here we have the percent of the population in the US that are alive for specific decades. So from data from 1901 and between 1901 and 1910, the life expectancy at birth was of 52 years. What does it mean? If we exposed a population to the age-specific mortality rates that were measured from the US back in 1901 to 1910, people would live on average 52 years. And what we see, because this life expectancy, okay, is better than it was centuries ago, but it's low compared to what it is now, we see that already from the first age group of 0 to 1 to the next one, 1 to 4, the percent of people alive drops a lot, from around, of course, 100% to around 90%. And then we drop below 80% already in the age group between 25 to 29. And really, a lot of people dying in younger ages back in the 1900s, between 1901 and 1910. And then we have the shape of this curve or percent of people alive by age group. Data from 1951 and 1960, the life expectancy increases to 72. And then you start to see people living longer. So a higher percentage of people living into older ages. So here we reached around 90% already, like 10% of the population died before reaching age 1. So infant mortality rate really, really high back in 1901, 1910. And in 1951 already, 50 years later, what we see that you're gonna have 10% of those people that are born, they die only when they are already around ages 50, 54, 55, 59. So around these two age groups here. So that's a huge increase, huge improvement in mortality. Whenever we say improvement in mortality, mortality rates decline, and then life expectancy at birth increases, okay? More recent data from 2011, the overall life expectancy at birth in the US around 81, and then you have even more, higher percentage of people alive at even older ages. We get 10% of the people dying only when we reach around, let's say, 60 to 64 years of age, right? Instead of 1 to 4 years of age. And if we had a theoretical exercise, the last one is a theoretical exercise. Let's make everybody being alive until age 100, and then everybody dies after that. Because of the adjustments that we have in the life table to estimate life expectancy at birth, in that case, when we have everybody alive up to age 100 and then everybody dies, if we do that exercise on life table, we're going to get a life expectancy at birth of 108. And that's how this curve would look like. And that curve has more a rectangular shape, right? So that's why when we say that a population is improving mortality, mortality is declining, a higher percentage of people are alive at older ages, these curves start to be closer to this theoretical curve here, in which everybody is alive up to age 100 and then everybody dies, right? So that's the process of rectangularization of mortality. For most of history, life expectancy fluctuated between 20 and 30 years of age. So people on average lived only 20 to 30 years of age. So really, really low life expectancy at birth. About 2/3 of babies survive to their first birthday. So 1/3 of babies died before reaching age 1. 33%, really, really high infant mortality rate. And about only half of them were still alive at age 5. And now we have 99% of kids surviving up to age 5, right? Around 10% of the population made it to age 65 in pre-modern society before the 1800s, right? Before industrialization. And now it's 90% of the overall population reached at least 65 years of age. So just to show that this process in which we take it for granted that we now live on average around 70, 75 years, it's actually something that started in these last 200 years, okay? So whenever we see this really old series about the Roman Empire and everything, and we see those old people there, they were not 60, 70 years old. They were maybe 40 years old, 50 years old. Mortality was much, much higher at that time. And it's funny, I don't know if you have seen, there is a Netflix series called Peaky Blinders, right? Peaky Blinders, about a mob in England or in the UK. And some of these new series, it's interesting because they show these really old societies and they try to show how it was, how in that case, the whole series is more about violence, it's more about mobs, disputing territory and everything. But it shows also the daily life, where people work, how the conditions were, with all the coal, all the smoke, really, really bad conditions of health and everything. And then this woman it's in one of the characters there, it's a woman that she's reported being really old, and she's 40 years old or 50 years old or something. But it's just interesting that's just now in this new series, people are starting to talk about that and actually show how the conditions in those years were. So it's a new thing, right? Because whenever we see these old stories, documentaries, or even fictional movies about old times, we don't understand this. I think the new productions and the new documentaries and series have been tackling that much better. But Peaky Blinders is really interesting. We have been seeing improvements in mortality over the years, the decades, but it's still, we have a lot of variation across countries. So a lot of African countries having female life expectancy at birth below 60 years of age. So all these countries in yellow, they have life expectancy at birth among women below 60 years of age, while in some South American countries like Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and also Australia, New Zealand, here in North America and Western Europe, you have an overall life expectancy of women of at least 80 years of age, okay? So it's still a lot of variation. And this is just to give an idea of how life expectancy and mortality varied throughout the history. So in pre-modern society, like below the 1800s, life expectancy, these are life expectancy among women. It was between 20 and 30 years of age. So for those societies that is they estimated 20 years of age on average for women, only 63% of women survive up to age 1, 47% up to age 5, and only 8% of women survived up to age 65. Exactly because mortality is so high here, a lot of people dying before reaching those older ages, you need high fertility to replace the population. So first required to have zero population growth was around 6.1 children per woman in that specific example, exactly because mortality was so high, small percentage of people reaching these older ages, you needed a lot of people to have a stable population size, zero population growth. In the US and Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it's the late 18th century and early 19th century, the life expectancy at birth for women was around 40. And then you start to see a higher percentage of women surviving to older ages. And births required for the population to don't decline in size started to decrease. So it decreased from 6.1 to 3.3 children per woman. And so here we are talking about the 1700s and 1800s, so 18th century and 19th century, okay? And then in more recent years, looking at the world for specific subgroups of countries, we still have a lot of variation. Some sub-Saharan African countries have really, really low levels of life expectancy, really high mortality. So their levels of life expectancy, it's actually similar to how it was in the 18th century in the US and Europe of 40 and 46. And still only 34% of women surviving up to age 65. The world average of around 2015 was the life expectancy of women increased to 73. And then you have all the specific examples here, Mexico, US, Canada, and Japan, that has the highest life expectancy in the world, the lowest mortality. But then if you compare to around the same years for sub-Saharan African countries, you see this huge discrepancy, right? 46 to 86. Sorry? Japan, I think one thing that's discussed a lot about Japan, why they have so high levels of life expectancy, low mortality, is really related to nutrition and also health habits. I mean, nutrition for them, a lot of their food is really based on seafood because of their location. And also the health habits that we see, that we have nowadays in our society, they have been in Japan for a much longer time. When Japan, centuries ago, were dominating China, they kind of enforced in China the need to wash scissors before cutting the umbilical cords of children, of babies in China. So basic health measures that were not implemented in China, in Japan, they were already going on. And since Japan was dominating China, they enforced those health measures, right? So all these health measures that now we take for granted, they have been in Japan for several centuries. But also, in our contemporary society, the health habits in terms of nutrition, the kind of food that they eat, not so much sugar or all this high-fat food that we have in the US, that's not a common thing in Japan, right? And the food much more based on seafood. But still, even with this better nutrition and health habits, the difference overall to the US and to Canada is not so high, right? We gain by having better nutrition a few years of life overall on average, but what's more important is the quality of life, right? People that have better health habits, work out throughout their lives, they not only live longer, but they have better health later in life, right? And that's a huge discussion about the US, that the rates of obesity are so high in the US, affecting children, really young children, and then reversing it throughout their lives is really difficult. So they might survive into old ages, but they might experience a lot of health issues in their lives later on, like diabetes, and that will affect their last 10, 15, 20 years of life, right? Yeah, but basically I would say nutrition and health habits as a whole for Japan to have so high life expectancy at birth. In the Roman area, the life expectancy was around 22 years of age. People who reach adulthood were not too likely to reach a very advanced age, although of course some did. So that's because of this discussion in this other textbook by John Weeks that I kind of like remind me of this series about the Roman Empire. Right? The plague, the Black Death, hit Europe in the 14th century, having spread west from Asia. An estimated 1/3 of the population of Europe may have perished from the disease between 1346 and 1350. And what's interesting, this happened so many years ago, in the 1300s, in the 14th century, and this disease still exists today, and it's not really clear why it killed so many people back then. This was probably due to generally poor health and few resources to battle the disease, such as both in terms of health habits, washing their hands before eating, basic things, having sewer system treated water to drink, but also having fewer medications, right, to treat the diseases. The Colombian Exchange, when Europeans invaded the American continent, also increased the incidence of diseases in the native population in the American continent and killed a lot of them. So Columbus and all European explorers took diseases, horses, and guns to the Americas, brought back new foods and few new diseases. One explanation for the relativity is in how Spain dominated Latin America and Portugal as well after arriving in the 1500s is exactly because explorers had immunity from the diseases that they brought, and those diseases killed the native population. And compared to the devastation that diseases affected this indigenous population and the overall population of the native people decreased a lot because of these exchanges of diseases, but also, of course, afterwards because of all the different wars that happened. I mean, in Brazil, a lot of the native population was not only killed by the Portuguese when the Portuguese invaded Brazil, but also afterwards when that population started to settle in the areas of São Paulo and Rio, started going west in Brazil to conquer more land and killing more native population, which is the same thing that happened here in the US, right? And during the Industrial Revolution between 1760 and 1840, the plague in the Little Ice States had receded. Now, the production of food, of resources is done in a much larger scale. So people now make more money, there are more resources, everything is more modernized in the way that resources are produced, and that improves nutrition, housing, and sanitation. So at that time, life expectancy in Europe and in the US reached around 40 years of age. So was population growth a cause or an effect of rising living standards? Maybe you started to have an increase in population because fertility was still high. And by having more people can produce more and can be part of this industrial revolution and then increase life standards, as we discussed here, or it could be the other way around. Because now with the industrial revolution, we have better nutrition, better sanitation, better housing, we live longer, and then a higher proportion of kids reach older ages and population grows, right? So it's pretty much, there is a reverse causality there. There were as many deaths to children under age 5 as there were at 65 and older. So mortality among children was really high, of those that didn't reach age 5. Infectious diseases were still the dominant reasons for death, but their ability to kill was diminishing, exactly because of better nutrition, better housing, better sanitation that we start to have during that period. Okay? And then in the 19th century, so we can see some main elements that contributed to postponing death, that contributed to people living longer. Belief in the power of human intervention. So the overall Western culture that developed science, and then people starting to follow recommendations of science, and development of vaccinations, and people get vaccinated and following basic health measures and taking medicine, that make people live longer, not dying. And that's so sad that something that started so long time ago, we have to still have all this debate about the importance of vaccinations in our contemporary society, in our current society that we are experiencing now, the pandemic, because it's like, okay, if I'm not as young as you guys, but if I get the coronavirus, the chances of me dying are still low, right? Still low. But if I get it, I can pass it to people that have higher chance of dying. So the thing of me wearing a mask and getting vaccinated is not about me. It's about other people. That if I pass the decision, then they will die, such as my children, who are below the age of 5, and there is no vaccine for them yet. And older people that I interact with them in society. And how that disappears with ideology and politics, even nowadays, it's crazy. It's unbelievable. During that period, there was also an improvement in nutrition. Also happened first in Western Europe. Clean water, toilets, bathing facilities. I just mentioning just the fact of washing the scissors whenever you're cutting the umbilical cords of babies when they are born. Basic things, right? The implementation of sewer system in cities. Some sanitation studies in Liverpool show that exactly the implementation of these sewer systems improve the health of the population. That's why it's interesting that other documentary that I told you about, Netflix, it's more about Bill Gates, but in that specific episode that I put the link in our course website, one of the topics of that episode is he putting money in order to develop technologies that would take care of our residuals that would actually be used as a sanitation system. But instead of like having to go underground and build all these really expensive sewer systems, it tries to put money into research that would create, that would develop this new technology to deal with sanitation. And it's interesting that that's actually good for poor countries, because once that technology is developed, it's cheaper to implement than implementing the sewer system that we have, for example, here, right? With all this underground sewer system that we have traditionally. Vaccinations start to be developed for smallpox, for example. The validation of the germ theory. We have the development of antiseptic procedures, cleanliness principles in surgery. not only cutting the umbilical cords of babies with clean scissors, but also cleaning the tools while doing surgery. Basic things that for now we take it for granted had to be developed, had to be implemented, had to be proved to be accepted in our societies. Louis Pasteur in Paris former experiments about germs diseases. And this thing about vaccinations, I mean, it's this movement anti-vaccinations, we saw that even before. I mean, here in the US, you always like to create these terms. Here, the anti-vaccination people, that they are usually higher proportion of them are really well-off people, higher socioeconomic status. So people not vaccinating for really basic diseases, you start to see the spread of these diseases exactly in the neighborhoods that are the richest ones in the US, like Malibu and so on. And now the people against the vaccination of coronavirus, oh, it's a new technology that was not well developed or well tested. I'm not an anti-vax. I don't believe in these vaccinations because it's a true new technology. Okay. It was tested already in so many people before it was approved or partially approved. It was already tested on so many people that got vaccinated. But yeah, maybe those people believe or belong to another century, right? And that's sad. That's sad. Mortality keeps increasing. Well, mortality keeps declining and life standards keep improving. In the 20th century, health is seen as a social movement leading to government creating universal health care systems to provide health care to the society for free. And of course, most developed countries have these universal healthcare systems, and the US is an exception. Brazil has a universal healthcare system organized by the federal government and with branches that go to the state and municipal level. And Brazil is not a developed country. Antibiotics emerged around World War II. More vaccinations were developed in the 20th century. Oral rehydration therapy for infants and adults was good to decline mortality. Advanced diagnosis, drugs, and other treatments for degenerative diseases kept people alive longer. Basic things, such as vaccinations. And that causes what? People to live longer. Simple as it is. Data, science, for Mexico, US, Canada, right? From 1850 to 2010 in this case. We have data for the US for all this period. For Mexico, it started here in 1900, and for Canada in 1920. Overall, life expectancy increasing, that means mortality declines. And also you have variation across countries. And the gap, the differences between countries, Mexico, US, and Canada, was much higher back in the 1920s than what it is in more recent years. For example, here in 2010, the life expectancy at birth among women, much closer among these three countries. Like you're talking about Japan, right? But Japan has really high levels of life expectancy at birth because of this historical way of dealing with health and nutrition that still is going on in society, influence the culture, daily life, exercising and everything. but overall, the difference between countries becomes smaller, right? Because now all countries are exposed to the same improvements in terms of vaccination, in terms of health habits, in terms of sanitation, in terms of medicine, right? And we can see a turning point in terms of mortality levels with World War II. So here we have pretty much 2 time points, 1950, 1955, life expectancy at birth for women, and then 2010, 2015. So right after World War II, this was the life expectancy at birth in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and North America. And then 60 years later, you see this huge improvement. And of course, the countries in Africa that had much lower life expectancy at birth among women, they increase this jump here proportionally is much higher than the jump in Europe from here to here, proportionally, or even in absolute terms, if you just subtract one life expectancy by the other. Because countries in Africa and Asia, they didn't have access to basic vaccinations, to basic health habits, to basic health infrastructure or public infrastructure, to medications. When those are imported and implemented in a quick way, their mortality declines and life expectancy increases. In Europe and North America, that process of improving mortality or declining mortality, increasing life expectancy was slower, right? But then the technology that was developed in Europe and North America is exported to other areas in the world. And then those other countries improved fast by importing that technology, okay? So there are 2 ways to postpone death to the oldest possible ages: prevention and curing people. Prevent diseases from occurring or spreading when they do happen. So prevention, vaccination, drinking clean water, sanitation, having a sewer system implemented, having good nutrition, eating less hamburgers, drinking less soda, and so on, smoking less, drinking less alcohol. And for that case, no physician is needed, right? It's more like a daily process, a daily change in life, a lifestyle. And then the other way of postponing death is curing people of disease when they are sick. And then you need more advanced diagnostic technology, drugs, skilled physicians. Cool. And we also see a transition in nutrition, which is related to obesity, even in developed countries. In previous centuries, the poor people were skinny because only the rich could afford to access enough quantities of food, but not anymore. So all this high fat and processed food in fast food restaurants, for example, that's pretty much 99.9% of the restaurants in College Station. This really bad food that's available to us here, that's the cheapest food, right? So the poor people have access to all this really bad food overall. I'm not just talking about College Station, our societies nowadays. Bad food for health is cheaper than good food, right? Organic food is much more expensive. So the nutrition transition is a worldwide change towards people having diet high in fat and processed foods, diet low in fiber, less exercise, and then increases in degenerative diseases, okay? The two terms that I mentioned before that we would discuss, lifespan and longevity, is something that I already mentioned before. Lifespan is what's the oldest age in which we recorded a human being ever reaching. And that was a French woman who died in 2016 with the age of 122 years and 164 days. And in this case here, the lifespan, when we go into that specific individual, it's really related to the genetics, to the biology of people. Of course, if that woman didn't have enough resources for her throughout her life, she would not have lived so long. But whenever you're talking about lifespan, we are trying to measure that individual that reached really high ages. When we are talking more in demography and we are trying to understand a population as a whole, we are talking about longevity, life expectancy, the average age in which we normally die, the expected number of years to be lived on average by a particular population at a particular time. It's now around 71 years of age for all humans. And it has both biological and social components. It is related to medication. It is related to health habits. It is related to nutrition and so on. Populations with high mortality tend to have high morbidity. It's not a one-on-one relationship, but societies that have high mortality and low life expectancy, they also tend to have a higher proportion of the people experiencing some kind of disease related to exactly morbidity. And on the other hand, it's not a one-on-one relationship because some countries we might live longer because maybe having access to more medications in a more affordable manner, but we might live longer but not having a health condition. That's what I mentioned before. Some people living their last 10, 15, 20 years of the last 10, 15, 20 years of life in really bad health conditions, really depending on other people to take care of them. And that's not completely related to medication. It's more related to the lifestyle of these people throughout their whole existence, throughout their whole life. Humans are like most other animals with respect to the general pattern of death. The very young and the old are the most vulnerable. Young adults, you all are the least likely to die. Risk of death are relatively low after the initial year of life, after kids reach 1 year of age, lasting until middle age. And this period here corresponds usually to the reproductive ages. So between 15, 49 years of age, that's when you have really low levels of mortality. And then beyond middle age, mortality increases, although it has been increasing, but not in such a steep way as it was in previous decades, in previous centuries. So this is a graph that I showed you before, showing the age-specific mortality rates per 1,000 people in Japan, Guatemala, and Nigeria. Really high levels of mortality at younger ages, and then it declines, reach the lowest levels around 10 to 14, 15 to 19. You stay in these low levels up to around 45 to 49, and then it starts to increase in a little bit more steeper way compared to the increase that we saw in previous age groups. But this increase here is not so fast as we saw in previous decades, right? But overall, we still see a lot of variation between countries and in age groups. For example, Nigeria, that has higher mortality, this high level of infant mortality rate is experienced again only of people with around 75 to 79 years of age. Mortality in Japan is much lower. So this level of mortality will be experienced by people in a little bit younger ages, 50 to 54, because a lot of improvements were already done here that Nigeria did not experience yet. Mortality also varies by sex. Women have a lower probability of death at every age from the moment of conception. So that's a biological reason. Women overall on average live longer than men at all age groups. Their mortality rates are lower in all age groups. But if we have some societies that don't give the same conditions to women, such as access to food, healthcare, education, that will affect their health, and then you can see higher mortality among women than among men. And this is important because there are several studies that show some countries that have still a preference for sons whenever more poor families have both sons and daughters, and they have limited resources in terms of food, they tend to give more food to the sons instead of daughters. And that will affect their health later on. And also even the chances given to boys of going to school and pursuing higher education is much higher among boys in less developed countries than among girls, right? That's really clear. And that will affect their earnings, their life quality, their life standards later on in their life, okay? There are several other mortality differentials by region of residence. People living in urban areas have lower levels of mortality than those in rural areas. So people living in urban areas have better life standards than in rural areas. People living in slums, exactly related to poverty, related to less access to infrastructure, have worse health than people living in other areas of the city. People with better education live longer as well. The rich live longer, have more resources. And in terms of race ethnicity, being the minority groups in societies make them have worse health and higher mortality than the majority group in a specific society. So that's why all this discussion about the increase in diversity in the US, it's actually going to be positive to the whole population, because you create a more diverse population in which everybody is seen more equal and deserving the same opportunities, and that creates better health and mortality standards to the whole, or similar mortality standards to the whole population. And we discussed also that usually households in which the couple is formally married, they usually have better health. But of course, all of these associations here, and I talk with this term, association, not causality, because there is a lot of reverse causality there. So the association, the terms here, maybe because I come from a better educated family, a more well-off family, I have better chances to pursue higher education. When I pursue higher education, I will get a better job. And getting a better job, I will tend to marry. And I will marry someone that's similar to me. And we will have better life standards. And that will improve our health. And that will translate into the health of our children. So that's a process. It's a cycle that starts back in generations, right? It's not just, I say, yes, I do, I will have better health. No, it's not just that. It's not just getting married and getting better health. It's more the process behind it. Usually people that have more stable lives, have better jobs, are the ones that get married, and then they will have a more stable life, a more stable household, and that has positive impacts on health, declining mortality. Cool? Now, a little bit of a discussion about mortality trends and causes of death. The World Health Organization pretty much subdivides the causes of death into communicable diseases, non-communicable diseases, and injuries, right? Communicable diseases are bacterial, viral, protozoan, maternal conditions, and maternal conditions related to the lack of prenatal care while women are pregnant, delivering somewhere besides the hospital. A lot of countries still, women having birth at home, not as an option, because like there are like a lot of this tendency in more developed countries of women having the delivery at home, but even there is surveillance, and if anything more serious happens, people are moved to the hospital. In this case, you're talking about more rural areas that don't have access to hospitals for women to have their babies. Women seeking an unsafe abortion. Of course, in this university, in this state, all this discussion of anti-abortion groups, now with this new law that pretty much forbids women to have abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy, then they don't even know that they're pregnant. But abortion in a real life point of view is much more related to the conditions in which women live. And if they don't see that having a child is going to be beneficial to the whole family, to themselves, or to the future possible child that doesn't exist yet, the access to a safe abortion will be good to the health of the woman. And if you translate that yet number by number by number, that will be good to the health of the overall population. Then you can come to the argument, oh, but the fetus is a live being. Not really. From a medical point of view, in a scientific point of view, you have to reach 3 months of pregnancy to reach that point. And then the lack of access of a safe abortion and women seeking abortion in unsafe conditions, we increase the chance of them having complications and dying, and that will affect their health and the health of the population if you add number by number. This law in Texas is making women going to other states around Texas to have safe abortions. In other countries that the whole country don't have access to safe abortions, then women seek unsafe abortions, and that it is really detrimental to their health. Perinatal conditions is also one kind of communicable diseases. These are the conditions surrounding birth. The conditions just before and after birth. Remember, umbilical cord, clean scissors. Is it being in a hospital? Is it being done with a safe condition, clean environment and everything? Did it have prenatal care before? What are the conditions that the children have afterwards? If the children have some form of slow development, do they have access to the NICU, to intensive care for newborns? That's, for example, I have my children are twins. They are 4 years old now, a boy and a girl. The boy had to stay in the NICU for 1 week. the access of these conditions right after birth are really important, right? And that we have in more contemporary societies. Nutritional deficiencies. Nowadays, nutritional deficiencies, as I mentioned before, is not just related to the lack of food. It's also related to access of bad food, as we have in the US, and that's the norm here, access of all this bad fast food, right? And here are the overall, the major causes of death. The ones highlighted in gray are the communicable diseases, and the other ones are the non-communicable diseases. And this column here, we have the number of deaths in the world back in 2011 in millions. So heart disease, stroke, lower respiratory infection, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease have the highest number of people dying due to these diseases. And then the last four columns, it shows the numbers only for the top 10 death rates for each one of these groups of countries. High-income countries, upper middle income, lower middle income, and low-income countries. And then you see that in high-income countries, upper income countries, so only the 10 top death rates are showing for these countries, and most of them are related to non-communicable diseases. They are in the white cells. There is exceptions here, but most of them are in the white cells. Any more low-income countries, the top 10 death rates are experienced mostly in still communicable diseases. Malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, diarrheal diseases, all having still high death rates in low-income countries. So what you see here is that in high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, the top 10 causes of death are related to non-communicable diseases, white cells, while the more poor countries, the major regions of people dying are related to still communicable diseases. So we have been passing through epidemiological transition from high communicable diseases, the incidence of death due to communicable disease to low, but still you see a lot of variation between countries, right? And here, the 10 leading causes of death in the world: ischemic heart disease, stroke, COPD, and lower respiratory infection, really related to what we saw here before, right? And then lower incidence to these overall communicable diseases, but if you break down by groups of countries, then you see rates among low-income countries having deaths due to these communicable diseases. This map just shows the number of adults and children estimated to be living with HIV in 2013. And the biggest numbers in sub-Saharan Africa, 24.7 million. The numbers here in between brackets is a confidence level, because we have a chance that these estimates might have measurement error as in statistics. So this confidence level here from 23.5 to 26.1 has 95% of chance of containing the true number of people living with HIV/AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. And this confidence level, the confidence interval, is estimated for all these other subgroups of countries in the world, right? But still, you see that this major issue is observed a lot in sub-Saharan African countries. This is an interesting exercise that is shown in the textbook that we have here in this class. So thinking about, let's get 1,000 people. 1,000 people dying in the world right now. If we take into account the top 10 causes of death of low-income countries, middle-income countries, and high-income countries, and taking into account the size of these countries, right? We put together in one group the low-income countries, middle-income, and high-income countries. The high-income countries have around 16% of the population dying, right? 159 out of 1,000. 67% of overall people dying in the world are located in middle-income countries. 16% of overall people dying in the world, based on data from 2008, dying in low-income countries. 16%, 67%, 15.9%. And using these numbers as absolute numbers, right? Let's say let's expose this group of 1,000 people dying to the top 10 causes of death for these three groups of countries. 163 here, 677, 159. And this would be the number of people dying to each one of the top 10 causes of death in these countries. And then you see that in low-income countries, there's still a lot of communicable diseases. In middle-income countries, you start to see heart disease, stroke, that's not communicable diseases, but still you have respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, communicable diseases, still killing a lot of people in middle-income countries. And then in high-income countries, overall number of people dying is not due to communicable diseases. And what I like about this diagram is the fact that it takes into account the size of the population. So it gives us an idea that whenever we talk about high-income countries, which the US is part of, we are talking about a really small proportion of the overall population. Most of the people are here and dying due to heart diseases and stroke. Okay? This is life expectancy at birth for the world average, less developed regions, more developed regions, and the least developed countries. Of course, the least developed countries having higher mortality and they lower life expectancy at birth. But overall, you see an improvement. What else do you see in the graph? You see that the differentials between these groups of countries have been declining, right? The differentials between these more developed regions to the least was really high here from 35 to 65, 30 years difference in the life expectancy at birth, and here's pretty much 12 years of difference, right? The mortality and longevity in the US, this next portion of the chapter, focusing on the trends that the US is experiencing. As we have been seeing for the overall developed countries, mortality started dropping gradually in responses also to industrialization, in response to modernization. Much of the mortality reduction to happen before initiations of any public health measures. So it's more related to the overall improvement in socioeconomic conditions brought up by industrialization and modernization of the society. Life expectancy increased from 46 to 76 among males between 1900 and 2013, and from 48 to 81 among women. And of course, looking at the specific year, always women living longer than men. Okay? Most improvements happened from 1900 to 1950. Something that we already discussed, the germ theory, the control of infectious and parasitic diseases, basic habits that we start to implement in our daily life, boiling bottles of water and milk, washing hands, protecting food from flies, isolating sick children to don't spread it to others, ventilating rooms, improving water supplies, sewage disposal. And then after that, after the 1950s, life expectancy started to increase due to prevention, vaccination, basic health habits as well, and control of chronic diseases. Now we have more technology to deal with these more complex diseases such as heart disease and stroke and so on. Okay, so it's 2 p.m. now. I will continue on this lecture on Thursday. I expect to finish it on Thursday. And then we will have our exam 3 1 week from now on Tuesday. Thank you very much. And I'll see you guys on Thursday.